Quay, we have now arrived at topic 4 for the course, Learning from Story. This topic and topic 5 are concerned with Indigenous pedagogies, and these are the distinct practices that teach our ways of knowing, that transmit Indigenous ways of knowing. Storytelling is a primary mode of learning in Indigenous education. This topic reveals the significance of oral stories, features and characteristics of oral narratives, strategies for how storytelling can be used in teaching and learning, and just as important as the stories themselves, protocols for telling stories or working with Indigenous stories. Protocols being the systematic rules associated with Indigenous storytelling and their use. In this opening conversation, I want to talk to you about Indigenous literacies with the goal of contextualizing for you the role of Indigenous oral storytelling. Literacy generally means reading and writing to most people, and yet there's work by various educators and scholars who now tell us that literacy is much more than a set of skills. There are also practices, and it's these practices that contribute to how we make meaning. So you might hear multiliteracies as a way to talk about how learners process and express meaning. There's also been much research that tells us that literacy and what counts as literacy is shaped by the social and cultural contexts in which we live and learn. So for learners from diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds, they may experience literacy in different ways, and this results in a different set of practices that are not only valued for a group of people, but represent how knowledge is conveyed. For Indigenous learners, they're socialized into language and literacy through their own rich cultural traditions and ancestral languages. So for example, in my own work in family literacy, conversations with Aboriginal family and community members, they talk about how meaning is made through experiences with and stories about land and place. Indigenous children and youth who are raised in families and communities where oral tradition remains strong may have very different experiences with books. They may give authority to a person rather than to the written word. I think about Maori learners. They can be apprenticed into their songs, narratives, and genealogies that are their connections to family and place and their histories through approaches to learning that focus on memorization and shared interactions with others. These cultural practices that I describe then draw on storytelling in its many forms: song, dance, oral stories, symbolic representations. And I would say that these narrative traditions are every bit as committed to meaning making as the very privileged literacy that we associate with schooling. The challenge has been for educators to see how Indigenous literacies can then be linked with the literacy practices of schooling. The underutilization of the cultural practice of storytelling is really a missed opportunity for educators, especially since oral tradition in its various forms really fulfills the requirements for literacy learning, as well as high-quality literature. Indigenous storytelling in its characteristics can differ from the kinds of storytelling that we promote in schools and may be unfamiliar to some of us as well. So for example, Indigenous stories may differ in their structure. We're most familiar with stories that have a beginning, a middle, there's a climax, and then an ending with a resolution. Indigenous storytelling structures may take a circular form, may have no resolution, and they can end quite abruptly. There are stories within stories, and they may at times seem to have really no clear purpose at all. Storytelling in Indigenous contexts promotes oral language development, listening skills, and comprehension, as well as introduces learners to the literary strategies of metaphor, prediction, foreshadowing. For a good example of how Indigenous stories take up literary strategies, we can look at the cultural narrative of trickster stories. The trickster or shapeshifter is a significant cultural character in Canada's First Nations storytelling traditions. Whether Raven on the West Coast, Wassajizik on the Plains, Nana-Bojo among the Anishinaabe, or Gooselap in the Maritimes, Eastern provinces. There are certainly other names for this cultural character expressed in First Nations languages. It is generally through the antics or foolishness of this cultural character that we come to new understandings or teachings about the world. Foreshadowing comes into play as we know when we hear that the story will be about the trickster, we can immediately anticipate something's going to happen. There's irony because we know something will happen to the trickster, but he doesn't. The trickster is an ambiguous character, asking us, how do we identify with a cultural character such as this when we're really struggling with its contradictions? And finally, the artful repetition in these stories, as well as other Indigenous stories, is a poetic feature. There's metaphor in the themes of deceit, cleverness, wisdom that are all revealed in these stories. Indigenous educator and scholar Judy Ezeki Barnes cautions educators to consider how and why they use trickster stories, especially as these stories increasingly make their way into print forms. In her article, Unsettling Fictions, Disrupting Popular Discourses and Trickster Tales in Books for Children, she tells us that the trickster stories can certainly challenge Western assumptions and introduce other ways of knowing and interpreting the world. And while they can be entertaining, she suggests that these stories should help learners develop an appreciation and respect for a cultural group, as well as develop their historical and geographical knowledge of those people to whom this story represents. But what she really takes issue with in her writing is how these stories, along with others, can be appropriated or romanticized. The challenge, she says, is for educators and others taking up these texts, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, is to find ways to engage with Indigenous texts so that they're understood not in simplistic or stereotypical ways. She's telling us that if we want to work with Indigenous stories, whether oral, print, and indigenous forms, that we must engage deeply with Indigenous knowledges and begin the process of transforming our own understanding about the nature of stories and how we use them. This emphasis on transforming our own understanding brings us back to our theme of reconciliation and the decolonizing strategies introduced to us at the beginning of the course and certainly throughout the many conversations that we're having with others in the course. And we were reminded of the nature of this work when taking up Indigenous stories in the classrooms, schools, and communities by leading the solo educator, scholar, and storyteller, Dr. Joanne Archibald, in her book, Indigenous Story Work, Educating the Heart, Mind, Body, and Spirit. Now, this book is an important read for those who want to engage in Indigenous storytelling practices in ways that are respectful, demonstrate reverence and reciprocity, and assume responsibility. Stories shared with these very principles in mind give stories power, the power to educate, to heal, and to empower. Understanding the protocols and practices associated with Indigenous storytelling is really necessary, especially as our stories shift in their forms, like the trickster himself or herself. We see the broad range and creative ways youth and people in our communities are telling their stories in print, digital forms, translated from languages or our ancestral languages to English and French, used in schools, literacy programs, libraries, youth centers. And so I'm reminded of the narrative frame repeated in each of the 5 Massey lectures delivered by Indigenous storyteller and writer Tom King in The Truth About Stories. These lectures, which are more like stories and are certainly in book form and available online, are very helpful as they demonstrate the fundamental differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous storytelling in their themes, structures, and narrative strategies. But it's the narrative frame that he repeats at the conclusion of each lecture that is so important for us as listeners. It's a careful reminder when he says, "Don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard the story. You've heard it now." King, like Dr. Archibald, reminds us that stories carry with them significant social and moral responsibilities for both the teller and the listener.